In the early morning hours of October 4th, 1943, dozens of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts sat lined up on a cold English airfield, their massive frames dwarfing the ground crews working beneath them. To many pilots watching from nearby bases, these aircraft looked more like flying mistakes than fighters. They were enormous, heavy, slow to turn. German pilots had a nickname for them, a flying tank that couldn't dogfight. The numbers seemed to confirm it. The P-47 weighed several tons more than the German fighters it was expected to face. In a classic turning battle, physics was merciless. Lighter aircraft turned tighter. Heavier aircraft lost speed. And losing speed in aerial combat meant dying. American bomber crews had seen it happen. When German fighters attacked, the Thunderbolts struggled to keep up through sharp turns and vertical maneuvers. Enemy pilots learned quickly that if they broke away at the right moment, the bulky American fighters would not follow. Losses mounted, pilots were killed, others were captured after forced landings in occupied territory. Some never returned at all. To commanders back in England, the verdict seemed obvious. The P-47 was the wrong aircraft for the job. Plans were already being drawn up to replace it with lighter, sleeker fighters that could match the enemy turn for turn. But among the pilots of one fighter group, there was a man who saw something different. He had spent years flying and testing the Thunderbolt. He knew its weaknesses, and more importantly, he understood its strengths. The aircraft could not turn like a German fighter, but it could do something else better than anything in the sky. It could dive. And if used correctly, that single advantage could change everything. On this day, over Germany, the Thunderbolt was about to stop being a joke and start becoming a nightmare. The realization came from numbers, not instinct. At altitude, the Thunderbolt carried an advantage no one had fully exploited. Its massive engine delivered brutal power, and its thick wings stayed stable at speeds that lighter fighters could not endure. Where a turning fight punished weight, a vertical fight rewarded it. Height could be traded for speed, and speed could be turned into life. The Germans fought the way they always had: gain altitude, dive through the bombers, turn away before escorts could react. It had worked against every opponent so far: Polish fighters, French fighters, British fighters, even early American types. Doctrine had been proven by years of success. So the Thunderbolts stopped playing that game. Instead of clinging to the bombers at their altitude, the P-47s climbed far above them, thousands of feet higher. There they waited, invisible against the thin blue sky, engines throttled back, pilots watching and calculating. When German formations assembled for attack, the Thunderbolts did not turn toward them. They fell. The dives were violent. Nose down, full power, airspeed climbing past anything the enemy expected. 300 miles per hour, then more. Control surfaces stayed firm. The airframe held together. The jug became a projectile. The first pass was everything. 8 heavy machine guns firing at once, a wall of metal crossing the sky in seconds. Pilots did not linger. They did not turn. They did not chase. They punched through the formation and kept going. Then they climbed. It took minutes to regain altitude, but once there, the equation reset. Height became speed again. Speed became another attack. German pilots tried to respond the only way they knew how. They dove away. They turned harder. They pulled tighter. And their aircraft failed them. At extreme speeds, the lighter fighters lost control authority. Wings bent. Airframes shook. Pilots blacked out, under forces the Thunderbolt absorbed without complaint. What had once been an advantage became a trap. The sky began to empty. Not because the Germans stopped flying, but because they were no longer surviving the encounter. Within weeks, the joke stopped. The fighter they had laughed at was no longer turning with them. It was falling on them from above. The first full test of the new approach came without ceremony. German radar stations detected the bomber stream early, as they always did. Controllers scrambled fighter groups, confident that the familiar pattern would repeat itself. Climb above the bombers, line up the attack, dive through the formation, break away before the escorts could respond. But something was different this time. High above the bomber stream, the Thunderbolts were already in position, thousands of feet higher than the German fighters expected. Engines steady, pilots waiting. Altitude was their currency, and they were about to spend it. When the German formations finally assembled and began their climb, the Thunderbolts rolled over almost as one. The dive was immediate and brutal. Heavy fighters accelerated like falling steel. Airspeed climbed so fast that the German pilots never had time to react. They were still focused downward toward the bombers when the first Thunderbolt tore through their formation. Cannon shells and tracer fire erupted across the sky. One German fighter vanished in a flash of fire and debris. Another rolled inverted, trailing smoke, never completing its turn. The survivors scattered instinctively, trying to escape the way they always had. It didn't work. The Thunderbolts did not follow into turns. They did not slow down. Each pilot made a single high-speed pass, fired, and continued straight through. Then they pulled up, using their remaining speed to climb back to safety. The Germans tried to chase. They couldn't. Lighter fighters accelerated quickly, but they could not sustain the extreme speeds of the dive. When they attempted to pull out, wings flexed, controls stiffened, and pilots lost consciousness under crushing G-forces. Some aircraft simply came apart. The Thunderbolts regrouped above the fight, climbing back to altitude as calmly as they had descended. Then they dove again. What followed lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, the airspace above the bombers was clear. The German fighters that survived were fleeing east, abandoning the attack entirely. Not a single one reached firing range of the bombers. For the first time, the Thunderbolt had not merely survived combat. It had dominated it. Back at base, ground crews listened as pilots reported their kills. Gun camera footage confirmed what sounded impossible. Enemy fighters destroyed. None lost. No damage worth mentioning. Intelligence officers checked the reports twice, then a third time. The result was undeniable. The Thunderbolt, used correctly, had rewritten the fight. And this was only the beginning. Word spread quickly on both sides of the front. American bomber crews noticed first. Missions that once turned into running battles now felt different. Attacks came later, weaker, or not at all. Where German fighters had once torn into formations with confidence, they now hesitated, probing from a distance, searching for an opening that never appeared. Above them, the Thunderbolts waited. German pilots began to report a new threat. The heavy American fighter was no longer trying to match them, turn for turn. It was attacking from impossible angles, at speeds that erased reaction time. Pilots described being hit before they even knew they were under attack. Attempts to adapt failed. When German fighters climbed higher to counter the diving threat, the Thunderbolts simply climbed higher still. When they tried to stay low and force a turning fight, the Americans refused to engage. The Thunderbolts stayed fast, stayed vertical, and stayed deadly. Mission after mission followed the same pattern. The Germans assembled. The Thunderbolts struck first. The enemy scattered. Bombers passed through, untouched. Kill counts rose steadily, not by chance, not by lucky encounters, but by design. Every engagement followed the same cold logic. Height became speed. Speed became firepower. Firepower became survival. The numbers began to shock even Allied commanders. What had once been a struggling fighter group was now leading the air war. Enemy formations avoided their sector whenever possible. German controllers redirected fighters away rather than risk another encounter. Pilots who had laughed at the Thunderbolt now warned each other over the radio when its call signs appeared. The fighter that couldn't dogfight had found its war, and it was winning. Yet this success brought a new question. Was it a fluke? A single unit benefiting from luck and timing? Or had the Thunderbolt finally revealed its true nature? The answer would come soon, in the largest air battles the war had yet seen, because the Germans were not finished, and they were about to throw everything they had left into the sky. The next test came on a scale no one could ignore. Hundreds of bombers rose into the air, stretching across the sky in endless streams of metal. Their targets lay deep inside enemy territory, places the Luftwaffe could not afford to lose. German commanders responded the only way they could, by committing everything. Fighter groups launched in waves. Veterans with years of combat experience climbed hard, determined to break through before the bombers reached their objectives. This was no probing attack. It was a full commitment, the kind that decided campaigns. High above the bomber stream, the Thunderbolts were already waiting. They did not rush. They did not chase. They let the German formations assemble. Let them commit to their climb. Let them believe the moment was theirs. Only when the enemy fighters were locked into their approach did the Thunderbolts roll over. The dive erased all hesitation. Heavy aircraft accelerated like falling buildings. The sound inside the cockpit deepened as airspeed climbed past limits the Germans believed unsafe. Control remained solid. The jug did not shake. It did not protest. It simply fell faster. The first impact shattered the formation. German pilots tried to break away, but they had already lost the advantage. Turning cost them speed. Diving cost them control. Climbing exposed them to the next wave already forming above. Thunderbolts punched through again and again. One pass. Fire. Separation. Climb. Reset. The sky became chaos. Smoke trails crossed. Aircraft spiraled downward. Radios filled with warnings that came too late. Experienced aces found themselves reacting instead of deciding. And in air combat, reaction meant death. When the engagement finally broke apart, the bombers were still flying in tight formation. No fighters reached them. Not one. Back at base, the numbers stunned everyone who read them. Dozens of enemy fighters destroyed across multiple engagements. Minimal losses. No damage to bomber formations from fighter attack. It was no longer a question of tactics. The Thunderbolt had taken control of the air. German intelligence noticed the pattern immediately. They gave it a name, an American way of fighting that ignored tradition and punished predictability. Attempts to counter it only fed the trap. The enemy had lost the initiative. And once initiative is gone, air war becomes survival. By now, The mood inside the Luftwaffe had changed completely. Pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt stopped joking about it altogether. After-action reports no longer described it as clumsy or slow. Instead, the language shifted to warnings. Do not engage vertically. Do not pursue in a dive. Avoid prolonged contact. If Thunderbolts are present, disengage. That alone said everything. The Thunderbolts were no longer reacting to German tactics. They were dictating them. German fighters began approaching in smaller groups, hoping to slip through gaps. The Americans adjusted immediately. Squadrons staggered themselves in altitude, forming layers. If the enemy came high, the top layer dove. If they came low, the lower layer fell on them. There was always altitude to spend. Always speed to trade. Every encounter followed the same unforgiving logic. German pilots tried splitting their formations, attacking from multiple directions at once. It didn't work. Thunderbolts ignored the bombers entirely and went straight for the fighters before they could form up. The escorts had stopped escorting. They were hunting. Losses mounted. Veteran German pilots, men who had survived Spain, France, and the Eastern Front, began to disappear from the skies. Experience no longer guaranteed survival. Discipline and physics mattered more than instinct and courage. The psychological effect was immediate. German radar controllers redirected formations away from sectors known to be covered by Thunderbolts. Better to miss an interception than lose irreplaceable pilots. Entire regions of airspace became effectively closed. Meanwhile, bomber losses dropped sharply. What had once been a gamble became routine. Missions that previously ended in burning wrecks now returned with intact formations. Factories burned, rail yards vanished, oil facilities went dark. The strategic bombing campaign, once on the brink of collapse, found its footing again. The Thunderbolt had done more than win dogfights. It had stabilized the war in the air, and it had done it without changing a single piece of hardware. Only the way it was used. As the weeks passed, intelligence officers began to notice something impossible to ignore. The kill tallies kept rising. Not slowly, not gradually, rapidly. Mission after mission, German fighters were being destroyed in numbers that no one had predicted. What made it worse for the Luftwaffe was how concentrated the losses were. One American fighter group, flying the same aircraft everyone else called outdated, was consistently outperforming every other unit in the theater. The Thunderbolt group's score climbed past 10, then 20, then 30. By the end of the month, the number was undeniable. 39 enemy fighters destroyed, 39 aircraft that would never fly again, 39 experienced pilots gone from a force that could no longer replace them. And it had happened in a span of weeks, not years. German commanders finally understood the danger. This was not luck. It was not a temporary advantage. It was a fundamental shift in how the air war was being fought. The Americans had stopped trying to win the enemy's fight. They had forced the enemy into theirs. Attempts to counter the Thunderbolt failed one after another. New instructions were issued. Pilots were told to avoid climbing engagements, to disengage early, to never chase a diving P-47. These orders saved some lives, but they also meant abandoning bomber interceptions altogether. From the American side, the effect was immediate. Bomber crews flew with confidence they had not felt in months. Loss rates dropped sharply. Targets deep inside enemy territory became reachable again. The Thunderbolt had earned something no aircraft design office could engineer: fear. not the kind born of reputation, but the kind that comes from experience. German pilots who encountered the P-47 once rarely sought a second meeting. Those who did often didn't return to tell the story. By now, the laughter was long gone. The aircraft, once dismissed as useless, had become the most dangerous thing in the sky. And there was still one more test to come. By the time the air war reached its decisive phase, the verdict was no longer debated. The Thunderbolt had not survived despite its flaws. It had won because of them. The aircraft the Germans laughed at, too heavy, too blunt, too slow to turn, had forced a complete collapse of enemy air doctrine. The Luftwaffe had been built around a single idea: control altitude, force the fight, destroy the opponent in maneuvering combat. Against the P-47 flown the old way, that doctrine worked. Against the Thunderbolt flown the new way, it died. The American pilots stopped thinking in circles and started thinking in vertical space. Altitude became currency. Speed became armor. Momentum became survival. Every engagement followed the same brutal formula. Strike first, strike fast, never slow down, never stay. The result was not just victories, it was control. By the end of the campaign, the Thunderbolt groups had shattered the Luftwaffe's ability to mass fighters. German pilots no longer climbed confidently toward bombers. They scattered, they avoided, they disengaged early. The sky belonged to the Americans long before the war ended on the ground. Those 39 destroyed fighters were more than numbers. They represented lost instructors, lost leaders, lost experience that could never be replaced. Germany still had factories, still had aircraft, but it no longer had pilots who could survive against the new reality. The Thunderbolt went on to do even more. When the enemy fighters were broken, it turned its guns downward. Locomotives, fuel convoys, armored columns, nothing on the ground could withstand 8 heavy machine guns delivered at full speed. The same aircraft that ruled the sky began tearing apart the battlefield below. When Allied troops landed in Europe, the Luftwaffe was absent. Not defeated in a single battle, but exhausted, outmatched, and afraid to rise. That absence mattered. It meant soldiers reached the beaches alive. It meant supply lines stayed intact. It meant the war moved forward instead of stalling. And it all traced back to a moment when American pilots stopped listening to laughter and started trusting physics. The P-47 never learned to turn like a German fighter. It didn't need to. It learned how to fall. And when it did, nothing could stop it.